Your water's gonna be right here. They'll stay. Or you can. All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see so many people here on a Wednesday afternoon. We have a real special treat for you this afternoon. Let me just start off by saying that this is part of our International Law Lecture Series, and it is the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Cox International Law Center here at the law school. We were very fortunate to get a $4 million endowment 25 years ago, and since that time, our international law program has risen to be the 11th rated international law program in the United States. We also are fortunate to have one of the top faculty in the United States. The SISC study ranks us number 25 out of the 205 faculties of law schools across the country. And I do see that we have some of our faculty colleagues here. We have Professor Shabalala, Professor Webster. Am I missing anybody? I think that's it. But it's really always great to have our faculty here for you to see and meet. I want to tell you there's some upcoming events that are really special that I hope you'll come for. This Friday, we are hosting the International Chamber of Commerce International Court of Arbitration Conference. It'll be here at noon. And that's a really special and unique conference. We hope you'll come. April 8th through 9th is the 40th anniversary of our Canada-U.S. Law Institute Conference. And that will be over at the Tinkham-Veal Center because we're expecting a very large audience. On April 15th, here in this room, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Zaid, is going to be speaking. That was a very difficult lecture for us to obtain, and that date got pushed back a couple times, but it's locked in now, and we hope you'll come on Tax Day to celebrate your human rights and taxes. But now, I am very pleased to ask my colleague, Professor Shabalala, to introduce our very distinguished lecturer today. Shabo? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And one of the things I want to note is the extent to which this school makes a point of both supporting and enabling speakers like the one we have today to come here and engage with our faculty and with our students. It's an opportunity that we hope to provide more of as the year progresses. I'm fortunate because I get to introduce a colleague and a friend who has been working in the area of human rights for, well, at this point, a decade. He is UN Special Rapporteur on Toxic Waste and Human Rights. And this is one of the oldest mandates at the UN, but Baskut is also one of the youngest people to ever be appointed UN Special Rapporteur by the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights. And as such, has brought new blood and new energy to the mandate. And he will describe to you, of course, the core of the mandate, but it essentially has a history in the fact that environmental degradation has become one of the major threats and was a major threat to the realization of health and human rights. Baskut is also the head of the Environmental Health Program at the Center for International Environmental Law based in Washington, D.C., and has worked there for several years in combination with several of the other programs there. And SAIL has been one of the most effective NGOs working at the interface of chemicals and human rights. And one of the major sort of achievements of that has been, for example, the signing of the Minamata Convention on mercury, most recently, of which Baskut was a core part of support for. Baskut is also both a scientist and a lawyer, and brings both those skills to bear on the work that he does. But more than that, I think he presents the ability to bring empathy and compassion to what is a very, very difficult and challenging job. And so I welcome him gladly and look forward to the talk.
Thanks, Jabo, and good afternoon, everyone. I think, first of all, one thing that Jabo forgot to mention is a great deal of my start in public interest advocacy in international law came as a part of Jabo and working with him at CL's Geneva office in 2009. So thank you, Jabo, very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. So my name is Baskut Tuncak. I was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights implications of the environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and wastes. It's a long title, in 2014. As Jabo mentioned, it's an old mandate that was created in '95. And it's quite all right if you haven't actually heard about this mandate. Honestly, I think very few people have at this point. And so one of my goals with the mandate and with being here today and continuing to speak to people around the world is to raise awareness about toxics, and toxics not just about the impacts that they have on people, but the rights that people have and how they can use their rights to protect themselves, their loved ones, their communities from adverse effects of toxic chemicals and pollution. So, as I mentioned, the mandate was created in 1995. At that time, it was known as the Commission on Human Rights, which has now been replaced by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. The mandate came out as a response to numerous instances where hazardous waste was being dumped illegally around the world, especially in developing countries, and especially in Africa. Before the mandate was created, there were negotiations, and eventually a treaty was adopted that is now known as the Basel Convention. But according to many countries, the Basel Convention was not strong enough. It had and still has many weaknesses. And so 3 years after the convention was adopted, the relevant countries that were most concerned about the issue, the African group, took the issue to the Commission on Human Rights and established a mandate on toxic waste. The ship in the picture, you may have heard about this ship. It's the Probo Koala, as it says. It was owned and operated by a company named Trafigura. And Trafigura was a company that was based in the Netherlands. Some of you may have heard of this case. It's one of the most egregious cases, I think, in terms of toxic waste. But this case involved waste that was actually generated on board this ship. And the ship was stationed in the Mediterranean. And the reason that the waste was being generated on board the ship was because no one wanted to have this process done on land. It was such a dirty, dirty process, producing so much hazardous waste that no country, not in Europe, not in Africa, wanted to have this process on land. So the company, Trafigura, which is a multinational petroleum company, commodities dealer, does a range of activities, decided to do it on board this ship, and then decided that it needed to dispose of the waste somewhere. And it went throughout the Mediterranean, it went up the coast of Europe, and it ended up in a port, I think it was in Antwerp, maybe Belgium, and then maybe I think it went to Rotterdam too. But no one would take the waste in Europe because it was so hazardous. And then it decided, well, it would sail south, and it ended up in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, where they found a company that was willing to dispose of the waste. And so late one night, it pulled into the harbor, and the company came, unloaded the ship, and then disposed of the waste in the town of Abidjan, in about 18 dump sites around the city, open pits, and just dumped it. So the people in the city woke up with god-awful smell. 17 people died. Thousands, unknown numbers, but thousands at least, suffered health impacts as a result. And this was in 2006. Unfortunately, that was 11 years after the mandate was created. And so these issues are still happening, and they're still happening today. So if anything, actually, good, I think, came of this, this incident was increased attention at the international level to the importance of having a life cycle approach when it comes to managing hazardous substances and wastes. The best way to get rid of hazardous waste is to not produce it in the first step. But today, unfortunately, the way our industrial processes work, it's not a circular economy. We generate waste, pollution throughout the life cycle, starting with the extraction of natural resources, continuing to the synthesis of toxic chemicals, other materials, hazardous substances, producing products that they themselves contain hazardous substances, consuming hazardous substances, all throughout generating, using energy, emitting air pollution. And eventually, many of these pollutants end up in people, in the environment, in the food we eat. So figures from the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention show that there are hundreds of toxic chemicals in people, including babies that haven't even been born yet. Several hundreds of chemicals have been measured by the US CDC, by the Environmental Working Group, an advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. And these are translating into real impacts, not just on health, but also on our economy. Conservative estimates say that hundreds of billions of dollars can be attributed to the healthcare expenses of toxic chemicals in our society. And these are very conservative estimates that only look at a small sliver of the toxic chemicals that we're exposed to. The graph on the right is from data from the US Environmental Protection Agency. It shows childhood cancer rates over 20 plus years. And what it shows is a 20% increase, roughly, in childhood cancer. That's a 20% increase that can't be explained in that time frame by genetic changes, by lifestyle choices, and clearly point to environmental factors. But which environmental factors, it's very difficult to say at this point. And globally, what we're seeing is actually increasing use of chemicals. And these are projections by OECD and then the UN Environment Protection or Environment Program, UNEP, that show actually quite staggering increases in chemical production over the next 5 years, largest in the Asia-Pacific region. But in every region, there are at least 20% increases in chemical production. So that means a corresponding increase in the extraction of natural resources and quite possibly emissions into air and water without sound chemicals management, and greater risk in terms of human health and environmental degradation. Of course, you might argue that, well, some of these chemicals that we're increasingly producing might be safer chemicals. And that could be true. However, if you look at the estimates from venture capitalists and others, you see that the market share that will be occupied by green chemistry by 2020 is still pales in comparison to the volume of toxic chemicals which are produced around the world. The European Commission has estimated that 60% of the volume of chemicals which are produced today are toxic. 60%. And we're expecting to have a 50 to 60% increase in the Asia-Pacific region alone. The global community hasn't been ignorant to these production shifts and the impacts going back to Agenda 21 in 1992. There were two, actually, whole chapters dedicated to the issue of chemicals and waste. And then in 2002, at the World Summit for Sustainable Development, countries decided to announce an ambitious goal to achieve the sound management of chemicals by 2020. And along the way, many steps have been taken. The Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants has gone from a treaty that regulated chemicals, which were by and large obsolete, to one that is now actually regulating chemicals, which have been on the market. We've seen the Basel Convention evolve into a more strong instrument with a compliance mechanism, with now a ban on the the export of hazardous waste from OECD to non-OECD countries that will hopefully enter into effect. We have a new treaty, the Minamata Treaty, that deals with mercury. But there's still a great deal that still needs to be done. The number of chemicals that are regulated at the international level is 1/10 of 1%. So 1/10 of 1% of chemicals are subject to international regulations throughout their life cycle. This means that 26 chemicals are regulated throughout their life cycle under the Stockholm Convention for persistent organic pollutants. And the European Commission has estimated that there are at least 1,400 chemicals of concern out there on the market which are in use today. Now, the Stockholm Convention is good in the fact that it regulates chemicals throughout their life cycle, but the problem is that it regulates only a very small subset of chemicals of concern. These are some of the chemicals which are not subject to the Stockholm Convention or other international conventions throughout their life cycle. For example, lead, one of the oldest, most widely accepted toxic chemicals in the world, is not subject to rigorous controls throughout its life cycle. So in 2011, the UN Human Rights Council decided to expand the previous mandate on toxic waste. It expanded it in a very significant way so that it would cover the full life cycle of hazardous substances and wastes. So now all business sectors that use, produce, or release hazardous substances and all human rights that are implicated by hazardous substances are now within the UN mandate. So I assumed the mandate in 2014, and one of the first things I did was to do a series of consultations with states, with businesses, civil society organizations. I went to relevant international meetings, spoke with various constituents to hear what they thought should be the priorities under the mandate. And from what I heard, there was a great deal of concern about the lack of regulation at the international level on businesses. And currently, there's a great deal of attention being drawn within the human rights community to the responsibility of businesses to respect human rights. So one of my priorities under the mandate for the next 3 years is to look at what are the responsibilities of businesses when it comes to respecting human rights that are implicated by hazardous substances. And then the second priority for me is the rights of the child and childhood exposure. I think probably everybody here knows that children are the most vulnerable, but unfortunately, they're also among the least, there's the least amount of knowledge out there about what toxic chemical that a child is exposed to soon after birth, just before birth, what that translates into later in life in terms of adverse effects. So that's another priority for me under the mandate. If you're not familiar with UN Special Rapporteurs, we typically operate by giving reports, preparing reports to the UN Human Rights Council. These are thematic reports. In September of last year, I presented my first report, which is on the right to information, to the Human Rights Council. This September, I'll be presenting one on the rights of the child. And then in 2017, I was asked to do a report on best practices or good practices in respecting and protecting human rights that are implicated by hazardous substances and wastes. In addition to this, I'm also asked to send letters of allegation to states and businesses about issues of concern. And then finally, typically two to three times a year, I'm able to take a country visit to a country and investigate the situation firsthand on the ground, meeting with governments, businesses, and other stakeholders to get a better sense of what the problems are and what possible solutions could be. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to focus on a few of the country missions that I've done in the past year, starting with Kazakhstan. So in March of last year, I took a mission to Kazakhstan. I was surprised to learn that it's the 9th largest country in the world. I didn't know this before starting my research for the trip, but it's quite a massive country, and it is very rich in natural resources. And as a result, it has a heavy dependence on extractive industries for its economy. So any extractive industry you can think of probably has a presence in Kazakhstan, and thus all the associated issues, pollution-related issues, can also be found in Kazakhstan. In addition to issues related to extractive industries, going back to its history with being a part of the USSR, it has a legacy of nuclear testing. In the northeast corner, there's a region that's called Semiplasnik. And if you look on Google Maps, you'll see that it's kind of grayed out. That was the nuclear testing site. And there they detonated over 400 nuclear bombs several decades ago. And some of you might also have heard of the RLC and some of the issues there with the drainage of the sea to irrigate farmland and such, and then the corresponding runoff of pesticides and fertilizers. So the RLC has now shrank. In the map, you can see that it's sort of horseshoe-shaped, but today it actually is two separate, much smaller seas that's heavily contaminated. And then another legacy issue is the town of Shymkent, where they were manufacturing lead bullets for the Soviet army. And as a result, the entire town is heavily polluted with lead, and children have elevated blood lead levels, of course, living and playing in such a contaminated area. It's estimated by some that as many as 40,000 children have elevated blood lead levels. And I'm sure you're at this point well aware of what that can translate into after everything that's been happening in Flint. So at this point, maybe what I could do is play a short video that an advocacy organization did about a situation in the northwest of Kazakhstan. It's called Berezkova.
On the morning of November 28, 2014, a tragedy occurred in the Kazakhstani village of Beryozovka. During morning classes at the local school, 25 children and 4 adults became ill and fell unconscious. Such a large-scale occurrence had never before happened in the village. What could have caused such unexpected and mass harm among the villagers? For the residents of Beryozovka, the answer is clear. For over 10 years, they have been demanding that their village be relocated from its dangerous proximity to one of the world's largest oil and gas condensate fields, Karachaganak. On the evening of November 27th, the residents had noticed flaring at the field, and in the village, they smelled gas. Karachaganak is one of the most dangerous industrial complexes in Kazakhstan. The field is being developed by the international consortium Karachaganak Petroleum Operating BV, KPO, which comprises the companies BG Group from the UK, ENI from Italy, Chevron from the US, Lukoil from Russia, and Kazakhstan's Kazmunaygaz. For many years, the residents of the village have been breathing hydrogen sulfide and other emissions from Karachaganak. Independent air monitoring in the village has indicated the presence of over 25 toxic substances. Almost 50% of the villagers are chronically ill, and 80% of the children suffer from respiratory diseases. The tragedy, which occurred with the children of Beryozovka, should have been the final indication to the authorities and to KPO that living next to the field is life-threatening.
Хватит травить наших детей. Мы требуем переселения от компании и властей.
However, the residents' hope for an objective investigation and a decision to relocate them was quickly squelched. Officials have made every effort to hush up the scandal and drop all charges against KPO. In the opinion of the bureaucrats, there is no connection between the emissions from the field and the mass poisoning of the children. Furthermore, they accused parents of not taking proper care of their children, who they say are addicted to junk food and soda.
А потом, как он уже идет в школу, тогда и на кириешки, дома он нормально не питается. Есть такой факт, я прошу не спорить. Я как аким могу, я как аким выражаю свое официальное мнение и как родитель.
The authorities also put intense psychological pressure on the children themselves, accusing them of faking their illness. Outraged parents noted the reluctance of doctors to determine the real cause of their children's illness. Medical information that was obtained during the first days after the poisonings has been withheld from the villagers. And the authorities refused to provide money for medical examinations and treatment of the children outside of Kazakhstan.
Вы говорите, квалифицированные специалисты. Да им баранов надо скотину проверять. Это разве квалифицированные врачи? Скажите, пожалуйста.
KPO's reaction has been cold and cynical. We're not breaking the law. We're not polluting the air. We don't have anything to do with this.
And please rest assured that the health of the Karachaganak field and neighboring community will always be our top priority.
Ощущение одно, вот действительно хотят не испортить имидж КПО.
The situation in Beryozovka is now critical. The November tragedy has accelerated declining health among the children who have felt the poisonous breath of Karachaganak for years. Between November 28th and December 9th, 2014, 91 residents of Beryozovka sought medical help. 75 of them were children, 1 in every 4 children in the village. Nearly every week, children continue to get sick and faint. On January 21st, 2015, 12 children became ill. On February 3rd and 4th, 8 children fainted. And on February 16th, 18 children at the school sought medical treatment. The residents of Beryozovka are in an untenable situation. Few in the community have the financial resources to move from the dangerous village. Many don't even have the money to pay for medical treatment for their suffering children. The villagers don't understand why they must pay for the greed of the authorities and oil giants with the health of their children. The villagers appeal to everyone with a heart. Help to save the children of Beryozovka. Demand that KPO and the government of Kazakhstan relocate the village of Beryozovka.
Я не буду здесь жить. Я вот вырасту и перееду отсюда, я никогда сюда больше не буду приезжать. Своих родителей заберу и больше никогда здесь не появлюсь.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a pretty difficult story. Fortunately, the village has been relocated at this point, but it took that video and many other campaigns and many other letters and a lot of pressure for the government to finally relocate them. The sad thing is, though, that there are other villages in Kazakhstan like them that are living in areas that are so-called sanitary protection zones, which is a false construct, assuming that the pollution doesn't travel beyond a certain boundary. And then there's this other town that we learned about on the mission called Kalachi. And Kalachi, you might have heard of it. It's known as the sleeping village, or Sleepy Hollow, as it's said up there. The town was suffering from basically a severe case of narcolepsy. People were falling asleep for 6 days or longer and requiring medical intervention in order to be awoken. And the authorities couldn't pinpoint the cause. They didn't know what was to blame. They knew that there were a lot of mining activities decades ago, uranium mining and so forth. But until they pinpointed the cause, the authorities didn't want to pay for the relocation expenses of several hundred community members. And finally, last year, they were able to determine that it was carbon monoxide that was coming out of a uranium mine that was improperly closed that was leading to this. In October of last year, I also went to the Republic of Korea, and this was an interesting mission. The Republic of Korea has undergone a sharp period of economic growth over the past several decades. You can see by that graph. It's quite a remarkable transformation, I would have to say. But with this growth has also come many issues, and many issues involving hazardous substances. So I'll just talk about a few here. One of the cases that came to my attention, and one that I think really hasn't had enough attention within the media or elsewhere, is the case of a humidifier disinfectant. It was manufactured by several companies, but a UK-based corporation called Reckitt Benexa was manufacturing 80% of what was sold in South Korea. And a humidifier disinfectant is essentially a chemical that's added to the water tank to keep it from growing mold or bacteria or other impurities. And the company that was selling the chemical to RB is SK Chemical. And essentially what happened is in 2004 or 2005, some cases started to come up where children and women were coming down with respiratory illnesses that they couldn't explain. And after some investigation, they determined that these women were using a humidifier when they were pregnant. And the chemical that they were adding to the humidifiers was sold on the market as a product that would actually make your humidifier safe and clean and make you yourself healthy. I think the tagline for RB is Health, Hygiene, Home. Unfortunately, the chemical was not tested for possible adverse effects as a result of inhaling the substance. And RB, if you're not familiar with this company, it's actually a pharmaceutical company. So if any company in the world should have the internal capacity to assess the risks of certain hazardous substances, it should be a pharmaceutical company. But unfortunately, they did not. And over, I'd say, 6 years, up until 2011, there were 143 deaths that were attributed to this humidifier sterilizer, and most of the victims were women and children, unfortunately. In total, they've identified over 500 victims, and the only way that they've been able to identify these victims, or they've accepted to identify the victims, is based on a proof of purchase. So the government really doesn't know exactly how many people could have been victim to this product. There are about 11 or 12 companies throughout this supply chain that are implicated who are also selling the humidifier sterilizer. But there still hasn't been a causal link established, even though the cases went away after the product was withdrawn in 2011 from the market. There still hasn't been a causal linkage established between the chemical additive and the adverse health effects that were attributed to the use of the product. Another case that was brought to my attention involved workers within the semiconductor manufacturing facilities. As you know, South Korea is home to many electronics companies, Samsung and others, and semiconductors are used in a wide variety of them. In 2003, many of the young women who were working at Samsung's facilities started to develop leukemia, lymphoma, were suffering from miscarriages and other adverse health effects that that women typically of that age don't suffer from at that rate. And this has been a very politicized, very divisive debate within Korea. Samsung is viewed by some as the model of this rapid economic transformation within Korea that's happened over several decades. And there's a great deal of pride attached with Samsung. And then there's another viewpoint that takes a drastically different perspective. But anyways, this debate and the impacts that these young women were suffering from played out in a very public fashion within Korea. Recently, there was a mediation committee that was established. The mediation committee put forward three recommendations, including prevention. And then the other two recommendations being an apology and compensation. The initial response from Samsung was to take the recommendation of the mediation committee with respect to compensation, but with respect to prevention, they said that they would handle it internally and rejected that. Recently, there have been some developments that seem to point towards taking on board all of the mediation committee's recommendations, but that depends on many different factors, including the implementation of an independent oversight committee. And in December of last year, I went on a mission to Germany. Germany is the birthplace of the modern chemical industry. It's home to BASF, the world's largest chemical company, Bayer Crop Sciences, which is one of the world's largest pesticide manufacturers. This was a mission that was primarily to examine good practices, because there are many things that Germany has done right when it comes to managing hazardous substances, phasing out certain substances that can't be managed in an environmentally sound manner, and to take those lessons and bring them forward into the report that I was referring to in 2017. But one of the things that kept being brought to my attention was issues involving the impact of German businesses abroad. And one of those was around highly hazardous pesticides. You may be aware that the EU is a global leader when it comes out to phasing out certain highly hazardous pesticides. And they have done so fairly progressively. They have something that's known as a hazard-based cutoff, where if a pesticide is a carcinogen of certain level of concern, an endocrine or hormone-disrupting chemical of a certain level of concern, and so forth, it shouldn't be used. And they've I think banned at this point 83 pesticides that the U.S. has not banned. They're quite progressive in this regard. However, German businesses like BASF and Bayer continue to export highly hazardous pesticides abroad, including to Latin America, to India, and other countries where the systems are widely acknowledged not to be in place to be able to manage these chemicals in a safe manner. One case that's been brought to my attention involved a small village in Peru, in the Andes, where kids mistakenly took a bag of methyl parathion, a white powder, a pesticide, highly hazardous pesticide, and mixed it in their school with water, thinking that it was milk, dehydrated milk. And unfortunately, 24 children died and another 24 were injured. Coloring agent could have been added to the package. A smelling agent could have been added to the package, something to give some indication that this was not milk, it was something that shouldn't be consumed. But none of those precautions were taken, let alone labeling of some sort. Another case that was brought to my attention, and this is something that the mandate before me has looked at quite closely, is the practice of shipbreaking. Germany has the world's largest shipping fleet in terms of tonnage. And those of you that might not be familiar with shipbreaking, it's the practice by which ships are quote unquote recycled. In some cases, they're taken into dry docks and dismantled in an environmentally sound manner. But in some cases, like in India and Bangladesh, they're brought on board or brought up onto the beach, and kids climb on board and they dismantle them with bare feet, bare hands. They're burning parts to get at other parts for recovery. These ships are loaded with asbestos, they're loaded with PCBs. and other toxic chemicals that either enter into their bodies directly or pollute the beaches and the water and contaminate the food supply. It's a very, very, very nasty business. And the EU does have a new regulation on shipbreaking, but there are various loopholes that allow for, I think it's upwards of 80% of German ships to continue to be destined for beaches where they're improperly disposed. So I haven't really talked about the human rights part yet, but the throughout these missions and throughout the cases we looked at, there were serious questions about principles such as equality, non-discrimination, whether within a country's own residence or transnationally across borders, and certainly the right to life, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to food, the right to safe water. These were all implicated one way or another throughout the cases I looked at. But the ones that really stood out to me and really, I think, warrant a great deal more attention were rights that are typically viewed as civil and political rights, the right to information, the right to an effective remedy. In virtually every case I looked at, there was an instance where information wasn't available, it wasn't accessible, and in particular, for those that are the most at risk, information was not available or accessible. The lack of information directly translates in many cases into an inability to secure an effective remedy. The victim has to prove what substance they were exposed to, the hazards associated with that substance, the level at which they were exposed to that substance, and which actor or company or state to hold accountable for that exposure. The burden placed on the victim can be insurmountable, and it often is. So I want to leave time for questions, but let me just give a few recent examples from cases that have been in the media. Could we maybe play the video at the link at the bottom? This is a short video.
Whoa! I'm videoing it. What the f?
I think that might be a gas station or something.
I guess. Whoa! Oh! What the? No! No, baby! No!
Are we dangerous here?
Yeah, we're dangerous. Oh my God!
Oh dear! Are you filming?
Yes, I'm filming!
Whoa! Whoa! I think we are dangerous.
Let's go! Let's go down! Let's go!
Let's go! Take the stairs!
Come on!
You can maybe cut it here. That's pretty much it. I don't know how many of you saw that before, but that was an explosion in August of last year in Tianjin, China. It's clearly a massive explosion. But what I want to show you is actually in that picture in the top left. What you see are storage facilities that have completely been destroyed. But to the top right of that, those are residences. People were living in very close proximity to where that much explosive chemical was being stored, albeit illegally, but still. It's quite remarkable. And I think many of you may be familiar with the Bhopal disaster that happened in the mid-'80s, over 30 years ago. And there's actually a striking similarity between what happened here, even though the chemicals and the circumstances of the company were very different, and the course of events has been different. Bhopal gave rise to a set of laws dealing with the right to know and the right to information and special protections about the storage of hazardous substances, the information that should be available to first responders. There were, I think, 173 people that died in this explosion, but of those, almost 100 were first responders. They were volunteer firemen, and actually the explosion, it seems, was actually triggered by the firefighters rushing in and spraying water on chemicals that shouldn't have come into contact with water, and thus triggering the much larger explosion that you saw in the video. And then in November of this year, there was what's been called the worst environmental disaster in Brazil's history. A joint venture of BHP Billiton and Vale called Samarco was operating an iron mine inland. You can see in the top right there in the map. And at the mining operation, they had a tailing pond which stores waste that's generated during mining operations. And 2 years ago, the government did an inspection of the facility or this tailing pond and said, you know, there's some questions around the structural integrity of this. Unfortunately, it wasn't adequately addressed, and in November of last year, the dam gave way, and it unleashed what is estimated to be about 20,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools of mud waste down the Rio Doce. And tragically, 15 people died as a result when they were hit by a tsunami, essentially, of mud coming down on them. The livelihoods of countless people has been affected. The entire river is essentially has been dead and may never fully recover. The waste eventually flowed into the Atlantic here. You can see this. This is the Atlantic. And there are turtles and other sensitive species which are calling that their homes. The full extent of this probably won't be known for many, many years, if ever, but it's again another instance where the right to information and the need to give information to those that are the most vulnerable, those that are living in close proximity to a tailings dam that's been identified as being structurally vulnerable 2 years earlier without any sort of warning system, emergency procedures. It really calls into question how information was and could have been better used in that situation. So I realize these are sort of bleak stories, but there are good examples, and here's one example I want to give, and this is in response to increased measures within the EU to strengthen controls on the use of these plasticizers that are called phthalates. These are endocrine disrupting chemicals. Certain phthalates are recognized to be, and they're associated with a range of adverse impacts, from cancer to diabetes to obesity, and again, children are among the most vulnerable. The European Union led efforts to try to phase out the worst of these chemicals, these phthalates, and as the stringency of measures increased over the years, what you see in this chart is the rate of patenting to alternatives to certain phthalates that have come under increasing scrutiny by regulators around the world. And as the measures increase in terms of their strength and the time that they'll take effect, the rate of patenting increases. And in my view, this shows very clearly that industry can innovate, industry can respond, and industry can develop better solutions. It just needs to be incentivized. Unfortunately, the incentives are not there yet. The harms are still externalized. Consumers still don't have all the information they need to demand safer alternatives. Communities don't have the right information they need. But hopefully, with greater information, greater empowerment, and greater attention to these impacts, we can start to have businesses respond and to seize what's clearly a huge market for safer chemicals. And with that, I'll leave the next 10 minutes, I guess, for questions. Thank you.
What about gold mining in places like El Salvador? I hear that the water is 1/3 beyond repair, 1/3
Yeah, and the other third they want to use for a new gold mine, I think. A new gold mine, I think, is what I hear. But yeah, and gold mining, not just the large-scale gold mining, but also the small-scale gold mining. Small-scale gold miners typically use mercury for mercury amalgam. And one of the largest sources of mercury emissions into the environment is actually not coal-fired power plants, but it's actually artisanal and small-scale gold mining and gold mining operations. Yeah, there are some serious cases, especially in Indonesia right now, where communities are using mercury, even though safer alternatives exist. And children are developing abnormalities, deformities that are very strikingly similar to the Minamata disease that happened in the mid-50s and 60s in Japan, in Minamata Bay, as a result of mercury pollution. So, yeah.
So we see the business with Samsung. Now, how come, I know they make other, other stereo companies make stuff using semiconductors. So what is wrong? What did Samsung do that do wrong that the other companies had not done? I'm wondering what kind of stereo I should buy next.
Well, actually, within the electronics industry, this has been a reoccurring problem. IBM had similar issues in the 80s with respect to cancers and other adverse effects within their workers in quote-unquote clean rooms. And it was actually thanks to a FOIA request by a professor at Boston University that they were actually able to get IBM's own figures of the health records, actually, of their workers and see that there was a higher incidence of various illnesses amongst the workers that were working in their factories, manufacturing electronics and electronic components. Yeah.
Was it my imagination, or did it look like the areas that had the growth in one of those earlier charts for chemical manufacturing were the less regulated parts of the world, Southeast Asia, et cetera?
That's true. That's the real concern, is that there's very, very high levels of growth expected in countries that have nascent or even non-existent systems for managing chemicals. And then you have things like Tianjin, China, where even though the regulations are there on paper, they're just not adequately enforced. Yeah.
Baskut, thank you very much for a great talk. You said when you first took the mandate, you heard a lot of concern about the lack of regulation placed on international or multinational corporations at the international level. 10 or 15 years ago, the UN launched a similar effort to place human rights obligations on corporations. David Weisbrod, Professor Shabalala's mentor at University of Minnesota, put forth a very rigorous set of standards that would attach to multinational corporations. That was then shot down because multinational corporations said, we're not buying that. And so you have, 5 years later, you have the Ruggie Report, which is a much lighter, much more superficial set of obligations placed on multinational enterprises. What do you think the prospects are for some kind of international regulation, UN or otherwise, on the creation, transportation of chemicals by multinational corporations?
Well, I think there's two ways to go. There's one option within the human rights negotiations, and right now there are discussions about a new treaty on transnational corporations within the Human Rights Council. That could provide a stronger set of guidelines and requirements and standards for companies to adhere to when they're dealing with hazardous substances. But then when we look at the global chemicals arena, even though it's not phrased in terms of human rights, fundamentally what it's about is protecting human rights. And there the discussions, I think, in my personal opinion, are moving more and more, not immediately, but perhaps in the next decade or 2 decades, towards a stronger global regime. The current approach is one that's based on a treaty that is designed to manage just a small subset of chemicals of concern, whether it's one element like mercury or whether it's one class of chemicals like persistent organic pollutants. In my view, that's not sustainable. You can't scale that up to deal with 1,400 chemicals of concern that are known today and who knows how many thousands in the future. So there should be a much stronger global regime that's capable of addressing chemicals of concern if they're of concern, not because they meet a narrow set of criteria. So hopefully the two camps can converge and get towards a framework that both respects and protects human rights and adequately regulates toxic chemicals.
I have a question about remedies. Right? So you yourself represent one pathway of remedy, right? That groups and national groups can come to you and request your intervention in some ways, and what you can bring is both publicity, international attention, and the report that can occur. Are there other remedies that you would point to, first at the international level in the human rights framework, that are also available in this context besides the role of the rapporteur that nevertheless communities and individuals can access?
Well, it depends a little bit on the country in which the issue concerns, but there are complaint mechanisms and other mechanisms within the international human rights systems, whether it's at the global level or at the regional level, where complaints and cases can be brought forward. For example, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has a complaint system, which is overwhelmed with cases. But cases have been brought by communities, for example, in Louisiana, Mossville, Louisiana, have brought a case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, alleging human rights violations as a result of being located in such close proximity to chemical factories. Factories and other factories that are emitting high levels of dioxin, dioxin being a very, very dangerous chemical, one that's a persistent organic pollutant and regulated under the Stockholm Convention. So there are instances where these cases are being brought forward in various human rights arenas. So. I'd have to look that up. I don't know off the top of my head.
Aside from regulations or after the fact complaint mechanisms, how do you incentivize businesses to do it themselves? Because you're looking at a global issue, right, in a lot of different governments, and like you said, it depends on government, where it is, what it's a part of. How do you just get the businesses to do it? Do you have any ideas with that?
Well, certainly. I can talk about a few examples for what other advocates have been using, and one is looking at the companies that have the greatest exposure in terms of reputational risk to consumers. In particular, big box stores like Target and Walmart have been great leaders in terms of raising issues about toxic chemicals in the products that they're selling to consumers and encouraging their suppliers to phase them out themselves, far ahead of regulators, far ahead of US EPA and others. So that would be one way. But at the end of the day, it comes down to informing consumers, right? So that's the power of information. If consumers don't have the information, the retailers themselves have a hard time convincing their suppliers and others that this is a need and they need to phase it out.
Time for one more.
I'm sorry, I walked in a minute late, so you may have already said this, but what was your background prior to this being appointed to this position?
Well, I started out as a research chemist. I spent about 8 years as a synthetic chemist working for biotech and pharmaceutical companies in the US. Then I went to law school, and then I started working at the Center for International Environmental Law with JBEL. And there I was looking at issues related to intellectual property and the intersection with environment. And one way or another, I found myself working on toxic chemicals, and I've been doing that ever since, and I really enjoy it. So, yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you to Baskut. So, conversation can continue. There's a reception with food and drink. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at more Cox Center events.